This is a presentation that's going to show the main events that we're going to learn about this quarter, some of the big ideas. And so this quarter is going to begin with the French and Indian War. And at this point, there's still 13 American colonies right here along the East Coast, along the Atlantic coast. And they're expanding west, and they're going into what's called the Ohio Valley right here. And the French also claimed to own the Ohio Valley. The French had followed the waterways down you could say up the Lawrence River and then down the Mississippi to New Orleans. And so they claimed most of the interior. But both claimed this land right over here called the Ohio Valley. And a war broke out between the French and the American colonies, which spread into a general war between the French and the British. And the British call this the French and Indian War. And the British won. And so after the war, the land looked like this. The French are forced to pull out, and the British basically controlled all of Canada and all of the East Coast, everything east of the Mississippi River. And so this was good for the British, yet the British were in debt. And so they began to tax the colonists. And they taxed various things. Early on, they taxed sugar, they tried taxing paper, but they decided to stick with tea. And tea was a good thing to tax because virtually everyone drank it. So this is a way of making sure that you're taxing everyone. And so the British began to tax the colonists in order to pay the debt, primarily from the French and Indian War. But the colonists argued that they didn't have to pay this tax. This tax was unfair. And this was their main argument. They said, no taxation without representation. And this means you cannot tax us without giving us representation in Parliament. Parliament is a building located in London where they make the laws for the British. And so here's the Parliament building in London. And there's people there making the laws, but none of the people there were from the 13 American colonies owned by the British. They're like, hey, we need to have a say in these laws, is what the colonists were arguing. And so this conflict continued to increase. The British sent soldiers. At one point, the soldiers fired into a crowd. You guys are going to write an essay on this quarter. Later on, the colonists dumped a bunch of tea in Boston Harbor. This becomes known as the Boston Tea Party. The British try to respond by punishing Boston. They close the harbor. They say you have to pay for the tea. The colonists begin to gather weapons and form militias. And the British sent an army to seize these weapons and arrest the leaders. And a spy who was watching the British rode ahead. His name was Paul Revere. He wasn't the only one, but he's definitely the most famous. And so this becomes known as the Midnight Ride of Paul Revere. He warns the colonists who have these weapons and these militias that the British are on their way, and they're going to try to capture them and still take their weapons. And the next morning, the fighting begins, and this is the start of the American Revolutionary War. And so they create an army. The American army at this time was called the Continental Army, and they appoint George Washington as its head. And early on, George Washington loses most of his battles. But George Washington realizes that even though the British are better supplied, they have better generals, they have better strategies, and in a lot of ways, in some ways they didn't, but in a lot of ways they did. They had better weapons, tools, and better supplies. George Washington realized he didn't have to actually beat the British. He eventually realized he didn't have to win battles. He could just prolong the war till the British would give up. So he's like, as long as I stay alive and keep this war going year after year, the British are going to get sick of it and they'll pull out, is what he's hoping. During the war, after a year of fighting, the colonists decide, you know what? We don't want to be British anymore. And they declare independence. They say, we're a separate country. We're the United States of America. And this is in July of 1776. The colonists did lose most of the battles, but there were really few key important victories that they had. One of them is known as Saratoga, and the British were marching, a large army was marching through the woods, and they get surrounded. The colonists snipe them. They hide behind trees, and they kill a lot of the British soldiers. They focus mostly on the leaders, on the officers, and on their guides. So they're lost in the woods. They get surrounded and they surrender. And this brings in since America had a chance of winning, the British enter the war on our side, and they help America, and they help supply America, and this gives America a much more likely chance of winning. And a few years later, with with the French supplies, with French help, George Washington, with one army and a French army and the French Navy, surround a British army in the middle, and they cut it off from all supplies, and the British surrender. This is known as the Battle of Yorktown, and this becomes the final battle of the Revolutionary War. The British could have kept fighting, but this was a big blow, and they just kind of gave in and threw in the towel after this. And so they eventually signed a peace treaty called the Treaty of Paris, and the British grant America all the land from the East Coast all the way to the Mississippi River, and this becomes America. All this is territories, but this area right here is the 13 original colonies, which become the first 13 states of America. And the U.S. won its independence, but early on it still really struggled as a country. We were in debt. There wasn't really a strong plan of government that united the 13 separate states. Each state, in many ways, acted like its own country. A lot of them had their own currency, their own armies, their own laws. They started to tariff each other and pass laws against trade against each other. And at one point, there was a big rebellion in Massachusetts known as Shays' Rebellion. And this also scared a lot of people. So they decided to redesign the American government. And a lot of delegates got together in Philadelphia. Philadelphia was the biggest city at the time. It was kind of our earliest capital. And they got into this building. We call this Independence Hall. This is where the Declaration of Independence was also written. And they also wrote at this time, the Constitution. And they created a plan for government. They said, we're going to have a president. We'll have 3 branches of government, an executive, which will be the president. We'll have a legislative branch, which will write the laws. We'll have a judicial branch, which will judge the laws. And this is basically the last part that we'll talk about. We'll talk about the Constitution this quarter. So that's an outline for the quarter. And take a practice quiz. You got this.